With the recent success of the Ukrainian counter-offensive in Kharkiv Oblast, Ukraine has captured large numbers of vehicles left behind by the retreating Russians, including dozens of tanks. This, combined with the heavy armoured casualties in the first months of the war, has seen the resurgence of the notion in the West that the Russians are running out of tanks. Equally, I've seen those who support the Russian narrative state that due to Ukraine's inability to make new tanks, every Ukrainian tank lost is one that can never be replaced, and only due to NATO-supplied anti-tank weapons, Ukraine is still in the fight. Yet, Russia still has the largest tank force on the planet, and Ukraine's number of operational tanks have actually not diminished since the war started. So with this video, I hope to dispel both these narratives, alongside the overriding theme online, that this war has set a stopwatch to the death of the tank in warfare. The fact is, the tracks of these war machines will be churning Ukraine's soil until the last day of the war. Welcome to the Watchman's broadcast. Please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy this content and want to see more of it. But with that said, let's get rolling. Now, to start with the Russians, when the war started, the Russian ground forces committed around 1,200 tanks to the invasion. The separatists of the DPR and LPR also had at least 150 tanks, not to mention a Russian tank battalion was permanently stationed in separatist territory, meaning Russia started the conflict with 1,400 tanks. 7 months later, Russian and pro-Russian forces have been visually confirmed to have suffered 1,200 tank casualties, virtually the entire invasion force. This is a staggering number, and it is understandable why people think these losses are unsustainable. But if we look deeper, this is not as catastrophic as it would be for Western European armies. Starting with the Russian ground forces themselves, based on information from Oryx, they will have been able to repair around 40 tanks and incorporated less than 20 captured Ukrainian T-72s into their service without issue of incompatibility. Less than 60 tanks is of course nothing next to the loss of 1,200, in fact it's only 5%. However, if we look at each tank type lost by the Russians, you'll see they have far more waiting to replace them. The T-90 has the lowest casualty rate, with 24 of the original T-90As lost, either outright destroyed, abandoned or captured intact by the Ukrainians. Yet while Russia hasn't many in reserve compared to other tank models, it still has 200, so these can be replaced immediately, and at current casualty rates, the Russians will have enough replacements to go for years. Even the T-90M, the most advanced and modern tank in Russia's arsenal, has seen its pre-war numbers go from 67 to over 100. Only 3 have been lost in Ukraine, while another battalion, some 40 plus tanks, were delivered from the factories in the Urals to the Russian army in late April, and another battalion has been dispatched at the end of August. So while much attention has been given to the loss of T-90Ms in Ukraine, the numbers show they actually have more of them available now than they started with. The T-80 follows a similar pattern. 260 of all kinds, from the older T-80BV to the brand new T-80BVM, have been lost in Ukraine, but Russia has 3,000 T-80BVs and T-80Us in reserve, the majority of which have only been in storage for 9 years, and the bulk of them will therefore likely be serviceable, and certainly enough to replace the battlefield casualties. Only the T-80BVM losses will require the production of new tanks to replace them, and little more than 40 have been permanently lost to the Russian tank fleet. The T-72, the backbone of Russia's tank force, has borne the brunt of the casualties, with a little over 800 destroyed in total. Again, however, Russia officially has 7,000 more T-72s in storage. Admittedly, some of these tanks could be over 40 years old and are unlikely to ever be combat worthy again. However, even if just a third of these can be brought back to a serviceable standard, Russia can still replace its T-72 losses 4 times over. The only deficiency at this stage to the T-72 fleet is its more modern variants, the T-72B3 and the B3 model 2016. Russia only has Soviet-era variants in storage, that is, T-72As and T-72Bs, and given it will cost more time and money to upgrade these tanks to modern standards, at present it is unlikely Russia will do this due to its immediate need for more tanks. Given around 430 T-72B3s and B3 model 2016s have been lost in Ukraine, this means the modernised Russian T-72 arsenal has been reduced from around 1,400 tanks to under 1,000. Having said that, these can be replaced by older T-72s, just not of the same quality. As for the separatists, of the 66 T-64s they had operational at the start of war, they have lost about 40. but have captured over 40 from the Ukrainians. So they've essentially replaced all their losses from the battlefield loot they have gathered, and even damaged ones can be repaired, as the Separatists proved this in 2015. As for their lost T-72s, given the Russians will be using those in storage to replace their own casualties, they will likely need to make do with the T-62s that have been appearing at the front in recent weeks going forward, of which Russia is believed to have around 600. But as you can see, the numbers show that while there is a slight decline in the quality of Russian tanks through attrition, there is no sign that it will cause the Russians a genuine shortage of tanks. At this rate, the war will likely need to go on for over 2 years before the Russians genuinely cannot replace their tank losses, and that is assuming they make no new tanks. Not to mention, Russia also has an additional 1,700 tanks in active service that it did not commit to Ukraine, though to use these would certainly signal the expenditure of the Russian ground forces, not to mention leaving Russian southern and eastern regions without a tank force. Now, turning to a less explored topic, which is Ukrainian tank losses. At the start of the war, Ukraine had 985 tanks in service, of which 720 were of the T-64 variant, the rest an even split of T-80BVs and locally upgraded T-72s. Visually, some 270 of these have been confirmed as irrecoverably lost in combat, though the total is likely higher as there is not a camera on standby every time a vehicle is destroyed in Ukraine. But, even if we say over 300 have been lost, a third of Ukraine's tank force, these have already been replaced. Poland and the Czech Republic alone have supplied 270 T-72M and M1Rs to Ukraine, while a couple of dozen others have been sent as military aid by other Eastern European members of NATO, essentially replenishing all the Ukrainian tank casualties. As all have been modernised by their respective NATO countries, they are comparable to the late Soviet-era T-64s in use by the Ukrainians. Poland has also promised to send its indigenous version of the T-72, the more modern PT-91 Twardy, which will further top up the future casualties. In addition to NATO-supplied tanks, Ukraine has also captured large numbers of tanks from the Russians, some 400 in all at the time of recording. Now, the more modern Russian tanks the Ukrainians will not be able to operate indefinitely, which includes the T-72B3 model 2016s, T-80Us, T-80BVMs and T-90As. Though basic things like engine maintenance could be attained, many of these tanks have advanced optics and ERA that are beyond Ukraine's ability to reproduce, and therefore keep combat worthy if these components are damaged. Also, some fire more modern ammunition, so once the tanks have expended the ammunition stocks they were captured with, the Ukrainians will not be able to use them to their full potential. Of course, they could still fire older Soviet-era rounds, as virtually all tanks in this war have 125mm smoothbore guns. However, for the T-72AB variants and the T-80BVs, the Ukrainians could keep these running until they are destroyed, as these tanks they already operate. Even if damaged, the Ukrainians can repair them, as both the Milyashev factory in Kharkiv and the Kiev armoured vehicle plant are capable of overhauling tanks, even if they are not able to produce new ones. In total, this will give the Ukrainians, again based on Oryx, around 150 captured Russian tanks that can be retained, already providing them with a small active reserve pool. So, with all that said, both sides are still yet to actually start causing critical damage to each other's tank fleet, but this will not last forever. Ukraine will likely only be able to receive a few hundred more NATO-supplied T-72s before there would literally be no more left to give, unless the alliance started to purchase Soviet-designed tanks from outside of Europe or begin giving its own vehicles, like the Leopard 2. Ukraine does have a little under 600 T-64 tanks in storage, but many of these are in need of serious overhaul, and many will likely only be able to provide spare parts as they are in such a state of disrepair, especially as those tanks in best condition will already have been refurbished and put into service between 2014 and 2022, and those left will be the worst of the crop. Not to mention, though the Kharkiv plant and the Kiev plant can overhaul these, they will currently be focusing on repairing battle-damaged tanks, and both factories have been damaged to some extent by Russian shelling and missile strikes during the war, so will likely only give these vehicles attention as a last resort. Therefore, Ukraine will likely start to be unable to replace its tank losses after a year of fighting based on current armoured casualty rates, so sometime in early 2023 you'll hear about sending NATO-built tanks to Ukraine. Russia, though able to supply enough tanks to replace current casualty rates for another year and a half, will run out before it reaches that mark. Putin's partial mobilization has called up over 300,000 men, and these men will need an equal number of tanks. Given 1,200 tanks that accompany the invasion force of 200,000 men, we can therefore assume 1,800 tanks will support the new 300,000 strong army. At current casualty rates, the Russians will probably have enough vehicles in storage to maintain such a force for a little under a year from the time of recording, assuming it has the logistics to fuel, service and resupply these tanks. This would indicate, based on the current state of the war, the Ukrainian tank force will break before the Russian one does. But there is another problem facing both sides, and that is trained crews. Though the tanks will eventually be irreplaceable, crews already are, as a good tank crew realistically takes around a year to train, especially if you want a good tank commander. It is doubtful the Russians will train their new conscripts to this standard, and the Ukrainians will already be throwing whatever trained men they have to replace their lost crewmen. So as with World War II, it is likely both the Russians and the Ukrainians will risk running out of crews before they run out of tanks. Of course, I cannot predict the future, but I can assure you, tanks will be a dominant presence on the battlefield until this war enters its final phase, whatever that may be. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this more analytical video, and I'll hopefully bring you another one very soon. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like me to cover any other topics. Until then, have a pleasant day.